Hello everyone. My name is Xerri and I am an Associate Professor in Applied Linguistics and TESOL at the University of Malta. I would like to thank the organizers of the 11th International Hybrid Conference on Second Language Studies for inviting me to do this keynote on classroom research. The choice of topic is motivated by my interest in understanding how teachers, when they engage with research, but also when they do research, they get a better picture of what happens in the complex classroom environment that they find themselves in on a daily basis. I look at classroom research as a very valid form of professional learning, and I have sought throughout my career to encourage more and more teachers to find the motivation to ultimately engage in research. But I'm also aware of the challenges that exist for teachers when it comes to not only engaging with published research, but doing research in their own classrooms. And these challenges have to do with what they think research consists of, who it belongs to, and ultimately its relevance to them as practitioners. And it is these three issues that I will be unpacking in this keynote today. First and foremost, we need to acknowledge that when we think of research with respect to the classroom, we have to understand that there is this gulf between theory and practice, the world of academia and the research that it produces about the classroom and what actually happens in the classroom, and professional researchers and classroom practitioners. And this gap that exists, this gulf between the two, seems to constantly pose difficulties for classroom practitioners because they see research as something alien to them, as far removed from the daily concerns, and hence it has little value to them and to their learners. And this might be driven by how research as a word has certain negative connotations to them. In the literature on decolonizing research methodologies, we do come across the idea that for many indigenous cultures around the world, research is a dirty word because of how it was engaged in by those who extracted information from indigenous communities for their own benefit only, without ever thinking of how it could be beneficial for the people that were being studied. And in fact, more recently, an activist on social media criticized this kind of extractive model of research. And she talked about how when we engage in this kind of extractive research, what we're doing is engaging in exploitation. We are not giving value to reciprocity, and we're not exercising relational responsibility. Hence, when we apply these ideas to the classroom and to teachers' relationships with research, we might also realize that some academics who have built a career on the basis of their educational research might have also committed similar offenses. That is, they didn't give value or they didn't give enough value to relational responsibility. So in this talk, I'd like to unpack these three questions. First and foremost, I'd like to consider what is research? What are the conceptions that surround this particular phenomenon? Then I'd like to consider who owns research. Whom does it belong to? And do teachers feel that it is something that belongs to them as well? And finally, I'd like to consider the question of why do research? Why is it important to encourage teachers to see it as something relevant to the daily practices, to their own professional learning, and to learner outcomes. So first and foremost, let me start by considering what is research. And when we look at definitions of research, we come across diverse ideas. Research can be thought of as synonymous with human curiosity. That curiosity that leads you to try and investigate an issue, to learn more about it. Research can be considered as merely the act of trying to learn more about something that we don't currently know. And research could also be seen as the creation of new knowledge, producing knowledge that didn't exist before. In fact, I carried out a similar exercise by looking at scores upon scores of definitions of research in the literature. But I didn't limit myself to educational research only. I looked at definitions from a wide variety of fields. And there were certain characteristics that were common in all of these definitions. For example, the idea that research is a form of systematic inquiry, that research is about producing something original and significant, or else the idea that research needs to be disseminated, needs to be shared, needs to be published. However, as you might realize, these conceptions of research are very much derived from academia and from the way people working in universities and in research organizations think about research. Now, the problem with this is that these conceptions are, in certain cases, misaligned with the value that teachers give to knowledge and to knowledge generation. And what happens when we have this kind of misalignment is that the voices of teachers, they are not sufficiently valued, and in the process, the knowledge that they are capable of producing is sidelined. And hence, in the literature, we do come across calls asking for bi-directional communication. That is, more communication between the people working in universities, sometimes described as living in an ivory tower, and the people working in the classrooms. And if we manage to achieve such bidirectional communication, what we would manage to do as well is to bridge that chasm that I talked about at the very beginning of this keynote. One thing that we have to bear in mind, though, is that for teachers, the production of knowledge is very much entangled with practice. So whenever we consider the value of research for practitioners, we have to bear in mind that for them, practice is ultimately central. And the two elements cannot be separated. They cannot be kept apart. And this is a very important issue because it doesn't always happen in educational research. So one of the very first things we need to do is to broaden conceptions of research, to understand that research can be understood, can be thought of in multiple ways. And we need to look at it as something that is valuable for practitioners if we see it as happening in the language classroom. It is in fact something that can be thought of as a sense-making activity, as situated inquiry. That is, it's happening within the classroom. And we also need to think of classroom research as valuable because it allows us to understand teaching practices better. Classroom research is also driven by the need to improve teaching and learning, or in certain cases or certain kinds of classroom research is driven by that need to address issues and to enhance teaching and learning. But classroom research is most definitely research that values the experiential, research that values what happens within the four walls of the classroom. And if we don't understand that, then it is very difficult for practitioners to see the knowledge producing capabilities that they have as recognized by academia. The next question we need to address is who owns research? And here I'd like to share a quote by Kathleen Graves, a teacher educator. And Kathleen Graves talks about the idea that classroom research is valuable because it is founded on the notion that research is democratic. It belongs to everybody, including teachers and learners. And when we recognize that research is in fact democratic, inclusive, then this helps us to challenge those notions that it solely belongs to people working in academia, to people who have a university affiliation or whose job description makes them obliged to conduct research. Once we expand ownership, we realize that it is highly significant to recognize the efforts of teachers and learners who are engaged in knowledge co-construction on site, that is, within the classroom, in situ knowledge co-construction. And this kind of co-construction can ultimately lead us to value teacher-initiated research, that is, research that teachers do for other teachers and for the benefit of the learners. They do within the classroom for the benefit of the wider school community, and it is a means by which they can reclaim research ownership. It belongs to them as well. This is research that manifests relational responsibility, because ultimately, if teachers are conducting research in the classroom, they are much more likely to respect the learners, to respect their colleagues, and to ensure that exploitation, to use a term that I mentioned earlier, isn't happening. Here, we see how teacher research can help us to shape the field. But the field is being shaped not by external actors, but by people within the classroom. So this is a very valid way of thinking of the potential of classroom research. Two ways in which we can do this is firstly via research practice partnerships. These are partnerships between people working in universities and people working in schools. What's important here is that we underscore the value of mutual respect, trust, and horizontal power relationships, rather than this being a vertical kind of relationship. We need to ensure that it's mutually beneficial for all parties concerned. Another way of doing this is to bring in the learners as co-researchers, to see learners not as subjects to be studied, but as potential contributors to the knowledge production process. And Anna Maria Pinter, who has written quite a lot on this subject, she provides us with a description of a variety of roles that children can play in this process. Obviously, when I use the term learners, I don't necessarily mean children. They could be adult learners as well. But Anna Maria Pinter focuses primarily on children. And yes, learners can play the role of active participants, co-researchers, but they can even be empowered to do research themselves, and they occupy the position of child researchers. What this boils down to is the importance of extending ownership, ensuring that more people more practitioners, more learners feel that research belongs to them as well. In doing so, we will have managed to amplify a diversity of voices. Hence, what we know about language teaching and learning is no longer something that we hear about from academics, but classroom practitioners are also contributing to the conversations that are happening about the topics that matter to us. This means that we're encouraging participatory forms of research, collaborative forms of research, inclusive models that make the research process far more equitable. The third question that I'd like to discuss in this keynote is, why do research? And once again here I'd like to go to Kathleen Graves. And Kathleen talks about how when teachers conduct research in their own classrooms, they become learners of what they're doing, in the sense that doing research enables teachers to learn more about the complex environment of the classroom, to learn more about the learners, and ultimately to learn more about themselves. So doing research is something that reveals a lot about this complex context that they occupy on a daily basis. In fact, doing research can act as a form of professional learning, as I started saying at the beginning of this keynote. It helps teachers to improve what they do via systematic inquiry, but it also helps them to address the problems or issues that they might encounter in their job, as well as enables them to ensure that student learning is far more successful. At the same time, they are also positioning themselves as people who are theorizing about language teaching and learning. This means that in doing research, the process is helping practitioners to become reflective practitioners, to engage or to position themselves as reflective practitioners, to ultimately figure out what's happening in the classroom and to make sense of it, and to contribute to the conversations that we're having in the field. That is, they're contributing to the professional community, whether that community is in the school, that is the school community, or else the broader language education community that they form part of by being language teachers. And finally, it also helps them to advocate for change in the way we do language education on an international level. This leads me to a framework, the practice framework for classroom research. And these are 8 principles that inform classroom research. The first one being that when we think of research, we need to remember that it is entangled with practice. Hence, there is a practical dimension to it. That research needs to give value to the relationships within the classroom. That it is accessible to teachers by perhaps developing the research literacy. That we should encourage collaborative forms of research, teachers collaborating with their peers, with the learners, with people working in universities. Research is something that helps us to understand teaching better as a means of understanding practices and improving those practices. And research is something that is part and parcel of what teachers do on a daily basis. It's integrated in what they do. Finally, research is community-oriented. That is, it helps the community to grow and to learn. And it is empowering. It empowers teachers by positioning them as knowledge constructors. Those were my thoughts on the topic of classroom research. I hope you enjoyed learning more about classroom research. If you'd like to read my work, and I've published quite a few articles and books on the topic, you can go to my website, and I'd like to thank you once more for inviting me to contribute to your conference.